Massive pleasure to be here. Really, really happy to be here. I love this city. I've been here quite a few times for psychedelic conferences in the past. It's such a beautiful place. Spent the day in the park today with Eva, getting close to nature and shortening that gap between thinking and happening, and that was really nice. And massive thanks to Eva, who has put all this together and been the most amazing host and incredibly organized we could do with someone like that in our clinic. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk, we've got lots of time for this talk and then lots of time for questions as well afterwards. So save up all your questions and ask me lots of difficult things. That'll be good. So my name is Ben Sessa. I'm a consultant child adolescent psychiatrist, which means I trained as a medical doctor and then specialized in psychiatry and then specialized in child and adolescent psychiatry. And I want to talk to you today about my journey into psychedelics and why I feel that psychedelics offer the most promising new psychopharmacology that we've had for 75 years and how this could really change the future of psychiatry. So you're going to learn a little bit about psychedelics and how they work and what they do. We're going to learn a bit about child abuse and maltreatment and the developmental trajectory from child maltreatment into adult mental disorders and particularly addictions. And then why all of this has brought me to the door of psychedelics and particularly MDMA, which I think gives us the best hope for the future. So we have a problem in contemporary psychiatry. We have this top-down biological model that categorizes people into disorders, indications, diagnoses. And these categorizations are partially helpful sometimes, but they're also almost always not a good description of a patient and their needs. But we're stuck with them. And I would argue that we are today in contemporary psychiatry where we were in general medicine 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, or the turn of the 20th century, we were very, very good at epidemiology. We knew people got smallpox, we knew people got tuberculosis, we knew people died after surgery, but we didn't really know why, and we didn't really have any decent treatments. We treated them symptomatically. We gave medicines that made them feel a bit better. And then we learned about the antibiotics, and we learned about microorganisms that cause these infections. And it was at the beginning of the 20th century, with the invention of antibiotics, that we started to win the battle against infectious diseases. We finally got on top of that problem after centuries and centuries of losing that battle. Now, I would argue that we're in that place now in contemporary psychiatry. We're excellent at psychiatric epidemiology. We write these wonderful diagnostic manuals. We categorize who gets depression, who gets anxiety, who gets personality disorders, who gets eating disorders, who gets addictions, PTSD. But our treatments are, on the whole, not very good. And this is because we are treating them symptomatically. Now, the root cause of all of these disorders, any chronic, lifelong, anxiety-based disorder, the root cause is trauma. And it doesn't really matter what diagnosis you get. If you hurt a child, you humiliate a child, that child will grow up with some kind of mental health problem. And it's a red herring as to whether that happens to be an eating disorder, PTSD, or addictions. And so in psychiatry, we have this top-down biological model, and we treat the symptoms as they arise. And the pharmaceutical industry, they queue up to give us these compounds, these products that you have to take every single day to mask the symptoms. Doesn't cure the patient because it doesn't tackle the trauma, but you mask the overlying symptoms. And that's a bit depressing, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing with psychedelics. So this is not good enough, okay? We've had 100 years of modern psychiatry. I can't think of any other parts of medicine that would accept the kind of treatment outcomes that we have in psychiatry. We just get used to this. We've even lost hope as psychiatrists. We think of ourselves as palliative care doctors. We don't cure our patients, we get alongside them. Because the truth is, if you're presenting to your psychiatrist in your early 20s with a disorder like PTSD or addictions or a severe anxiety disorder, there's a pretty good chance you'll be speaking to that psychiatrist in your 60s or 70s. That is not good enough. I want to be an orthopedic surgeon. I want to get patients in, mend that broken leg, kick them out of the clinic and never see them again. That's what other doctors do. Why do I have to be a palliative care doctor that gets alongside my patients for life? And this is the sad thing. I think psychiatrists themselves have become learned helpless. We don't even use the cure word. It's a bit of a dirty word in psychiatry. You can't cure people. You can help them. Why can't we cure them? Why can't we mend that broken mind like the orthopedic surgeons mend that broken leg, discharge that patient and never have them darken our doors again? Well, I believe we now can. We need a new approach. We need to move away from this top-down biological model. And crucially, where is our antibiotic? And you can see where this is going. So, many ways to classify psychedelic drugs. This is one particular way. We can classify them according to their receptor modes of action. And now, if you're a purist, psychedelic it means classic psychedelics. And as I've been on so many panels arguing the taxonomy of psychedelics. Is ketamine a psychedelic? Is ibogaine a psychedelic? Is MDMA a psychedelic? And if you're very strict about it, then you'll say those aren't psychedelics. What most people think of as the classic psychedelics are these big ones: LSD, psilocybin, DMT, 5-MeO, DMT, mescaline, drugs that are partial agonists at 5-HT2A receptors. And if you're going to be strict about it, those are the psychedelics with a capital P. But I would argue there's many other drugs in different classes with different modes of action which certainly have psychedelic effects. So another big group is the entactogens, of which MDMA is the most well-known, and there's many others: MDA, MMDA, the 2 series like 2CB, 2CI, 2CT7. And these are entactogens. Another group is the dissociative anesthetics, of which probably ketamine is the most well-known. I have to mention ketamine because I'm from Bristol and people love ketamine in Bristol. Other drugs in this class are phencyclidine, which is a much longer-acting anesthetic, which ketamine came in to replace, and DXM, and also nitrous oxide, which no doubt you're all aware of. I don't see that many nitrous canisters in the streets of Prague. They're all over Bristol. And you can't go to a festival these days in the UK without someone in the tent next to you all night long going So this is a dissociative anesthetic, which I believe has psychedelic properties. And then tetrahydrocannabinol. If you use pure THC without any balancing CBD, I would certainly argue this is a psychedelic effect. And then there's a whole host of plant medicines like ibogaine and salvia, many, all with different sorts of effects. But I would argue that these are all psychedelic. Now, we can also classify psychedelics according to their structure. And most psychedelics fall into one of these two groups, the phenethylamines and the tryptamines. And of course, tryptamine and phenethylamine are endogenous chemicals within our brain. These are natural brain chemicals that are part of the synthesis pathways for neurotransmitters, which has led many scholars to wonder whether we have an endogenous psychedelic within our brains that's released in instances of non-drug-induced psychedelic-type experience, like near-death experiences or mystical or spiritual experiences. And I suppose if we're going to take a reductionist material point of view about life, then that must be the case, because every single human emotion and experience is biochemical at some level. Now, many people have suggested it might be dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and since Richard Strassman's famous book in 1995, The Spirit Molecule, there was the suggestion that DMT was produced or acts in the pineal gland. Now, I would like to debunk that myth. Since Rick's book in 1995, the poor old little pineal gland has been post-mortemed and mashed and EEG'd and electrophoresed and every single possible investigation, and there has not been found any significant amounts of human DMT in that little gland. And it's quite interesting, the psychedelic community talk about the mysterious pineal gland. It really is not particularly mysterious. We know exactly what the pineal gland does. It produces melatonin in response to light and measures and regulates our sleep cycle. So I really don't think the pineal gland is the place to be looking. If there is an endogenous psychedelic based around DMT, it's much, much more likely to be produced in the lungs or in the gut, where there's huge amounts of serotonin. But we still continue to look for an endogenous psychedelic within human brain. Now, going back to this issue of what do we call psychedelics? Well, what do we even mean by the word psychedelic? And this is very, very hard. I could probably answer the question, what is a psychedelic experience like, by playing it on the trumpet better than I could tell you. One of the hallmarks of the psychedelic experience is this word ineffable, which means cannot be described in words. So you can't really describe it. We can try and we can use words like this, and we can talk about perceptual distortions and changes in emotion and thinking and recall of repressed emotional memories and connection with the other and sense of oceanic boundlessness and everywhere and nowhere and inside and out and big and small and macroscopic and microscopic and all these wonderful, beautiful words we use to try and describe it. But it is by definition indescribable. Sometimes when I'm talking to a patient and giving them a psychedelic for the first time, I'll say, look, here's a good way of thinking about it. Imagine if you're walking through a wood one day and you come across an object on the ground and it's a new color and you've never seen it before. And it's not blue or red or green or yellow or black or white. You know it's none of those colors. It's new, you've never seen it. I mean, there's no frame of reference to describe that. But that's kind of what it's like. You know when you're tripping, and you know what it feels like to be tripping, but you can't really describe it other than I am tripping. So we can try, and we can use these words, and we need to use these words. And it's important that we try and convey what it's like. I suppose what I say to patients more than anything else is, you won't know what, I can't even speak about it myself, it's so impossible to say. It is very, very unique. It is very unique. But we need to try and find words. Now, there's lots of different ways of looking at the brain. This entropic brain theory is quite popular at the moment. So if we imagine that nice, tidy bedroom there. Now, that tidy bedroom requires a lot of energy and effort to keep it like that. Everything has to be put away in the right place and filed away, and that's good, but it doesn't naturally stay like that. The natural laws of the universe will gradually make it move towards that bedroom. And this is fundamental principle of nature. Things start out very organized. Hot cup of coffee. A hot cup of coffee has a very low state of entropy. It's very organized, but if you just leave it, it will move towards a higher state of entropy where it becomes more chaotic and less organized and cold because the heat is dissipated. No information is lost, but it doesn't stay in the same place. Now, there's arguments around the brain here. That highly organized state could be what underpins this sense of narrow, rigid thinking, being stuck in a rut, being unable to think in a new way. And this might underpin disorders such as depression, certainly addictions, obviously things like obsessive-compulsive disorder. And that's a good thing. It's good to have an organized brain. And a highly disorganized brain could underpin things like dream states, infantile consciousness, early psychosis, and psychedelic states. And it's nice to have a bit of disorganization at times as well, and it's about getting the balance right. And the psychedelic states offer this brief window of opportunity to be highly disorganized and not stuck in narratives. Now, another way of looking at this, and this is a wonderful pictorial example of some work that was done at Imperial College London, using multimodal imaging with EEG and fMRI. And what I like about this is this could be my brain, because I was one of the research subjects. But it's actually a collection of all the different brains put together. Now, the different colored areas are different regions of the brain. And under normal placebo conditions, as you can see, there's some connection between regions and some connection within regions. And on psilocybin, massive connectivity increased all over the brain between and within regions. So this is like the untidy bedroom. Massive state of chaos, high state of entropy. Now, what we're hearing increasingly these days is about the concept of neuroflexibility and neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. So these theoretical ideas that have been demonstrated through imaging about this extra connectivity, this extra chaos, we're starting to get more and more papers in now that demonstrate that these different drugs, and it's been shown with MDMA and psilocybin and DMT and ketamine, actually result in an increased neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, regrowth of central nervous system tissue. Now, this has been looked at in terms of in vitro studies. If you look at a tissue of nervous tissue under a microscope and you bathe it in ketamine, you can watch under the microscope as new neurons, new synapses, and new dendrites start to sprout. Now, this is, if we can replicate this and study this further, this is the holy grail of neurology. You know, we have these irreversible, degenerative neurological conditions like stroke, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, spinal cord damage. And the narrative all the way through medicine has been, if you damage central nervous tissue, it won't grow back again. So you break your neck, you are paralyzed. If you have a stroke, you will not, you're left with a scar tissue. If you have a degenerative progressive disorder like dementia, it only goes in one direction. It doesn't reverse. Now, if this can be shown to be true, that psychedelic medicine, with or without psychotherapy, actually results in the regrowth of central nervous system tissue, this is going to be fantastic news, not just for psychiatry and psychotherapy, but for the whole field of neurology. So far more work is done. It needs to be done. But what this means from a psychotherapeutic point of view is that under the influence of these drugs, your brain is in a therapeutic window of opportunity. So we have the opportunity to use these new pathways that are emerging and turn those into new psychological narratives and new behaviors. Because the one thing that underpins all chronic, lifelong, unremitting mental disorders is this sense of stuckness. And this sense of stuckness, as I'm going to go on to explain, arises very early in life. The core parts of our personality, who we think we are, how we describe ourselves, these narratives arrive very early in life as a result of the environment in which you grow up in. And it's very hard to shift them. Once you believe that you are a useless, worthless, terrible person who cannot achieve and is unloved and unlovable, it's very hard to shake that. Now, what's going on neurologically here is these pathways have become very well used, very ingrained, and they become your go-to default pathways. And so a mechanism that allows for regrowth of new pathways is an immensely powerful tool if we can use psychotherapy to then hone that regrowth into new narratives, new ways of thinking, new versions of oneself. So we talk about the concept of stuckness and rigidity, and the idea that once your personality is formed in your late childhood, adolescence, and into early adulthood, it stays. Now, that's not entirely true. If it was that fatalistic, then I'd be out of a job, and every other psychiatrist, there's no point in bothering because all the damage is done before you're 5 years old, so forget it, you're screwed. So we don't say that, but we do know that these narratives are very rigid and very difficult to shift. There are a few occasions where you see radical changes in personality. Head injuries. People can have a head injury or a severe neurological accident of some kind, and it radically shifts their personality. Toxic states, like infections, can impact on your personality and have a change. And psychedelic states. What a psychedelic state does is it induces this peak experience, which can result in this personality change, which can tackle these rigid narratives. And there's a little picture of Bill Wilson there from Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous, as you know, is a very rigidly anti-drugs, generally, organization. Religious conversion is an important thing for change in personality. And we probably all know people who were, I don't know, very stuck in their ways, very mean, horrible people, and then they find God or Jesus or whatever, and they change radically. So religious conversion, a mystical experience, is one way of doing it. Now, Bill Wilson talked about the higher power as being one of these powerful forces in helping you to overcome the stuckness of alcoholism. What AA don't tend to say much about is that Bill Wilson had 5 or 6 high-dose LSD experiences in the 1950s. And when he talked about the higher power, he was very much referring to the LSD experience as this opportunity to break through rigidity. Now, there's been some recent studies around personality change. This is Roland Griffiths from Johns Hopkins University. They found that psychedelic-naive psychedelic-naive healthy volunteers that were given 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin had radical changes in their personality that lasted for years. So they actually tackled these core parts of their personality through a single or 2 doses with psilocybin. And they found that the greater personality changes were seen in the patients, the healthy volunteers who had the greater mystical or spiritual experience. It gives you a whole new paradigm to look at life. Now, the whole world of addictions actually, psychedelics play a big part in the history of addictions. The majority of psychedelic research with LSD in the 1950s and early 60s was LSD psychotherapy for alcoholism. And a lot of this was carried out in Canada, in Sessa, in Canada. And what they did here, what was interesting about this, when Humphrey Osmond came up with this idea of LSD psychotherapy for the treatment of alcoholism, those of us that work with alcoholism, we know that there's a condition called delirium tremens, DTs. Now, the DTs is a dangerous, toxic state that occurs on sudden withdrawal from alcohol. If you drink alcohol high dose every day and then you just stop, about a day or 2 or 3 days later, you go into this severe physiological reaction. It's dangerous. It results in sweating and vomiting and nausea and high and low blood pressure, and it can go into metabolic disturbance and seizures and death. And it kills about 10 to 15% of people with untreated DTs. Now, another aspect of the DTs, this comes from withdrawing alcohol, is you have this intense psychotic experience where people see visions and they feel persecuted, and it looks a lot like schizophrenia. And it's occurring in the context of the DTs. Now, Humphrey Osmond, working in Canada, was working with alcoholics, and this is in the mid-50s, and they'd heard about this new product coming out of a lab in Switzerland called Delicid, LSD-25, and it says on the bottle, induces an organic psychosis, but perfectly safe. So they were like, wow, this is interesting, because one of the things about the DTs, those people who go into the DTs, if it doesn't kill you, about 5 to 10% of people who experience alcohol-induced delirium tremens go on to become sober because they've been so terrified by the nightmarish visions of this hellish organic psychosis, they just stop drinking. And they call that hitting rock bottom. So you just say, I'm never going to drink again because I don't want that horrible organic psychosis. So Osmond was working with these alcoholics, found out about this product, induces an organic psychosis, but perfectly physiologically safe without the nausea, vomiting, seizures, and death. So he was like, great, let's give our alcoholics this new compound from Albert Hofmann, scare the hell out of them with this organic psychosis, and see if that makes them become sober, like they would if they'd got the DTs. So they gave them LSD. Indeed, it didn't scare the hell out of them, but they did have an intense peak experience, and they did go on to sobriety. So this was really where this began, the concept of the mystical spiritual experience to induce sobriety and tackle addictions. And there was a meta-analysis of the work done by the Canadian labs, done by Pal and Terry, in Norway, I think, some years ago, and it was a meta-analysis, and they found very strong effect size for the studies done in the 50s, 60s with the Canadian group. So this really kick-started the modern use of psychedelics to treat addictions. And this study was done some years later. This is Bogenschutz, who, University of New Mexico, used psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to treat people with alcohol addiction. And again, what he found, the people who had the deepest spiritual, mystical experience, they tended to be more sober. You tended to get better results. The higher the peak experience, the greater the communion with God, or whatever you want to call it. So there was a link between the mystical experience and the success. Matt Johnson, who is also at Johns Hopkins and is a member of our scientific advisory team at Awakn, he carried out a psilocybin therapy study for nicotine addiction, and he found much, much higher rates of success with the patients who had a full-blown mystical spiritual experience. Now, nicotine addiction is very hard to treat, and it's very common. It's a massive public health problem. I think one thing that's quite interesting about nicotine addiction, unlike other addictions, it's not anywhere near as linked to psychosocial issues as other addictions. Most of the addictions to other compounds are associated with trauma and with psychosocial distress and all of those social issues that go with it, which makes healing very difficult. Nicotine is far more common across all groups, so it's a massive public health problem that really deserves decent treatment. And the treatments are poor. That's what's quite good about using psychedelics to treat addictions. It's what I'd call low-hanging fruit. The current treatments are so bad that it's hard to do any worse than the current best treatments. So Matt Johnson found, again, the patients that had the highest mystical spiritual experience had better results. Now, we've also got treatment with ibogaine for addictions, and ibogaine is an interesting plant from the iboga plant from West Africa, where it's been used for generations by the Bwiti tribes of West Africa, Gabon. It produces a psychedelic experience, but it also tackles the physical withdrawal symptoms of opiate withdrawal. So it's being looked at as a potential treatment for opiate withdrawal, because not only does it reduce that what's called noradrenergic storm that comes from sudden cessation of opiates, but it also produces this psychedelic experience, which in combination with psychotherapy can assist the patient in recovery. And actually there's some interesting anthropological data from West Africa in that those people who use ibogaine as part of their ritualistic ceremonies have much lower rates of alcoholism. And similar things have been found sociologically with, for example, peyote using tribes in Central America and North America, lower rates of alcoholism amongst those users. So ibogaine has some great promise, and there's a couple of studies. And someone said to me yesterday there might be a study in Czech Republic with ibogaine. I'm not sure about that, but somewhere or other. One of the potential drawbacks of ibogaine is it is cardiotoxic in some people. It causes bradycardia. And in underground practices, 1 in 300 people have died using underground ibogaine therapy. That's a very, very high number, 1 in 300 for an intervention. However, these are underground. In a clinical setting with screened patients who you carry out ECGs, there's no reason why this can't be done safely. But most of the psychedelic drugs are incredibly low risk in terms of physical toxicity. Ibogaine needs a bit of special attention. Moving on to ketamine therapy for alcohol use disorder. Now, this chap, Evgeny Krupitsky, working under the Russian Federation, he carried out 1,000 subject tests with ketamine-assisted psychedelic psychotherapy for alcohol use disorder from the early 90s onwards. And he used high-dose ketamine, which he compared with low-dose ketamine to see what doses were better. I had an interesting run-in with Evgeny Krupitsky. I think in 2007 at the ECMP meeting in Vienna, I was doing a talk on psychedelics, and I was talking mainly about MDMA and psilocybin, and somebody stuck their hand up at the end and they said, "You haven't mentioned ketamine once. What do you know about ketamine?" And I didn't know much about ketamine at that point, and I said, "Well, I understand ketamine is a very useful drug, but I don't know much about it. What you need to do is talk to this Russian guy called Evgeny Krupitsky, and he went, I am Evgeny Krupitsky. And we went out for a beer. He was a really nice guy. So he did these studies with ketamine, and what he found, no great surprise, he compared 2 milligrams per kilogram with 0.02 milligrams per kilogram, and again, the higher the mystical spiritual experience, the greater the levels of sobriety. So there is really a pattern emerging here, that it's this peak experience, this breakthrough, this life-changing mystical spiritual experience that seems to be so important for inducing change in addicts. Now, contemporary alcohol use disorder study with ketamine has been carried out by my colleague Celia at Awakn Life Sciences, and this was the world's first evidence-based placebo-controlled ketamine study to look at how ketamine compared to placebo, and she had very promising results. And we are now licensing this treatment and using this in our clinics in Awakn. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. So, again, the higher doses, the mystical experience creates the breakthrough when it comes to treating addictions. So I want to move on to 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine, which is a quite remarkable molecule and where I want to spend most of my time talking. But before we talk about MDMA, I want to talk a bit about children and child abuse and trauma, because in order to understand how MDMA works and the pathophysiology of MDMA, you really need to know about trauma. Now, child psychiatrists like me bang on about two things more than anything else. Number one, boundaries. No, you can't have another biscuit. Really important, boundaries. Number two, attachment. Attachment is this fundamental cornerstone of understanding human psychological development. Attachment is this wonderful, beautiful, reciprocal dance that goes on between the pre-verbal infant and the primary caregiver. It's amazing to watch. It's a beautiful experience. It uses modeling to a large extent. If the mother or the primary care, could be a father, holds their arms up like this, the baby goes like this. If the mother frowns, the baby frowns. It's a wonderful dance, and you can watch neural development happening as this occurs over the months. And this becomes this fundamental blueprint for how we develop. The fundamental parts of ourself, what is love, what is trust, what is friendship, what is a brother, what is a sister? Is it okay to kick, punch? Is it okay to lie? Is it okay to steal? Is it okay to drop litter? These things we learn when we are that high, and we don't really lose them. We keep them throughout the whole of our lives. We hold on to those fundamental principles, and these come from these very early years, and it's very difficult to shift them. Now, when we talk about child abuse and maltreatment, we often talk about sexual abuse and physical abuse, which of course are tragic, extremely harmful events in a child's life. But I always say don't take your eye off the ball when it comes to emotional abuse and neglect. These are absolutely damaging fundamental parts of child maltreatment that we often overlook. They don't hit the social services radar, so they often get missed, but they are profound in terms of how a child develops. I don't love you. Your dad doesn't love you either. We didn't want a boy, we wanted a girl. That picture you just drew, that's rubbish. Anyone could have done that. You're stupid, you're fat, you're ugly. No one's going to love you. You're never going to achieve anything. You know, nobody's being hurt, physically hit here. No one's being sexually abused. But that kind of drip, 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 drip emotional abuse throughout your whole childhood has a profound effect on your emotional development and your sense of self. So always think of those emotional abuse and neglect issues when you're working with a young person or a young adult and trying to figure out where did the damage come. So our patients in psychiatry, and those of you in the audience who are mental health professionals, will know that we work with people on the bottom rung of the ladder. They have multiple risk factors. We work with the patients who had poor parenting, poor education, sexism, racism, poverty, transgenerational unemployment, lack of hope, lack of opportunities. So multiple risk factors. And the thing about children is they're actually quite resilient. And you can have some of these risk factors, but then have strengths in other areas and you'll be fine. Most of the people who end up in psychiatric services have got all of these risk factors, and they stack up on one another. And this can make psychiatry look like a bit of a depressing place to work sometimes. But actually, another way of looking at it is look at all the therapeutic opportunities. Look at all the places we could intervene here. And indeed, I would argue that we could empty half of the prisons and half of the hospitals tomorrow with good care for primary caregivers of children under 5. If we can get this attachment relationship right, we massively increase the resilience of children and we massively reduce the likelihood of adult mental disorders and particularly addictions. It's the strongest effect size in psychiatry. You hurt and humiliate a child, you create a damaged adult with mental health problems. It seems so obvious, but it's extraordinary. Even when talking to other mental health professionals, they don't always get this. I've done a lot of work in prisons and with the police. They don't get this. It's so obvious for those of us that work with children and attachment. Now, here's a little physiology exercise for you. We can think of the brain in 3 different areas, yeah? The bulge at the top of the spinal cord there, that's called the brain stem. This is where really basic physiological functioning happens. So that's where blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, blood chemistry, blood temperature, all of these things are managed there up there in the brainstem. This is really basic. Cockroaches have that. Cockroaches have a brainstem that manages these things. You don't have to be particularly sophisticated. Now, if we move up the evolutionary ladder a bit further, we get to the midbrain. That red area there, sometimes called the mammalian brain. All mammals have this. It's a bit more sophisticated. It's an area of the brain that fires in response to stress and fear in the environment. Now, this is what we call a bottom-up reaction. No cognitive centers are required. It's a knee-jerk reaction. If someone comes running into the hall now with a knife, your amygdala, that red area there, which is in this midbrain, part of the limbic system, your amygdala will fire without any thought or any kind of higher centers. It would say, you're in danger, prepare. And it triggers a hormonal reaction called fight, flight, freeze. And it's a neuroadaptive response and it keeps you alive. Now, if we go even further up the evolutionary ladder, we get to this green area, the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is the uniquely human part of the brain. This is where we have our lofty human pursuits, like logic and reasoning and planning and thinking ahead and thinking about the past. And this prefrontal cortex is in a relationship with the amygdala. And it overrides the amygdala. So somebody comes into the room in a threatening way, your amygdala fires, says, get out, you're in danger. A fraction of a second later, your prefrontal cortex fires and says, well, you know, it doesn't look that bad. I reckon I could reason with this person. They look okay, and, you know, I've had a good day, and I'm feeling pretty confident. So the prefrontal response can overpower this knee-jerk reaction amygdala response. Now, that's a really good thing, and that's how we have this, these lofty human pursuits. Now, if you have grown up in an environment where you're constantly fearful, and every time your caregiver comes into the room, you don't know if you're going to get a kiss or a cuddle, or you're going to get kicked or punched or burned with a cigarette, or you're going to get raped. What you do is you grow a more hyperactive amygdala. You have physical brain changes. Trauma causes actual brain damage to the developing child. Your amygdala becomes hyper-reflexive. You have more networks, more connectivity. You find things more frightening. And this is a good thing. I mean, you could argue that PTSD is the sign of a healthy brain. Because if every time you hear the key in the lock, if you went running up to your caregiver with your arms up and you get a slap every time, you soon learn that when you hear the key in the lock, you dive behind the sofa. So this is a positive neuroadaptive response, this hyper-reflexive amygdala. And that prefrontal cortex, that green dot, is shrunken. you have less development in the prefrontal cortex. You're less good at seeing the good in people, at talking yourself out of fear. You just don't see good in people. Now, as I said, this is a positive, healthy brain. This is keeping the child alone. No one is looking after that kid. No one's feeding them. No one's caring for them. So they develop this as a way of surviving their childhood. But of course, as you then go into adolescence and adulthood, that becomes maladaptive because you're no longer being attacked. But your brain is in hangover from those early infantile years. So years later, you've got anxiety disorder and there's a big queue at the post office and you have a panic attack. And you experience that as being attacked. And you're not being attacked. The world is a benign place. Almost everyone everywhere is absolutely lovely. It's the truth. There are very few noxious, dangerous aspects to our modern society. Very few. I know the media tells us otherwise. But mostly everyone everywhere is absolutely fine. But if you've experienced this kind of development as a child, you grow up into adulthood believing that the world is dangerous. So, this is the good identity formation. So it's this experience of childhood trauma that results in this formation of narratives around self. So you have self-narratives. I'm a good person. I'm a loved person. I'm going to achieve. I'm attractive. I'm clever. I'm going to go to Prague University. And then you have these worldviews. That people are dangerous. No one's to be trusted. Get the boot in first. Even if someone says they like me, they don't really mean it. They're just trying to get one over on me, so don't trust them. And when you're faced with this insecure attachment, it's so overwhelming. Not only do you develop all kinds of different mental health problems to try and overcome this overwhelming reality of your world and the inside world and the outside world, that your best possible option is just to numb yourself with dangerous substances such as heroin and far, far more dangerous substances such as alcohol. Block out the world, soften the edges. And you cannot blame people for doing this. I would do this. I don't like pain. If I'm in pain, I'm going to take a painkiller. And if the painkillers my doctor gives me aren't good enough, I'm going to go and buy some heroin or drink a bottle of vodka because they work better. So you cannot blame your addicted patients. All they're trying to do is have the same brain state as you, where the whole world isn't terrifying. So addiction becomes this stuckness as an attempt to quash the fire of early childhood trauma. Now, I've clumped all these things together: child trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD addictions, because they're all the same. And there is no single treatment for these things. No single treatment. So we have what's called polypharmacy. People take all sorts of things, and they take different medicines to suppress individual symptoms. So if your patient is depressed, give them an antidepressant. If they can't sleep, give them a hypnotic. If their mood goes up and down, give them a mood stabilizer. If they're hypervigilance, this edginess that goes with PTSD, if that spills over into paranoia, give them an antipsychotic. So there they are. If they're just anxious, give them a benzodiazepine. There you go, 5 different courses of drugs, 5 different classes of drugs, all doing different things, none of which treat the cause, the trauma. They just treat the symptoms. They paper over the cracks. And the analogy I would use here is, if you have an infection due to a microorganism, a bug, one of the symptoms of an infection is a high temperature, a fever. Yeah? Now, it's really uncomfortable to have a high temperature. So you've got an infection, you can take paracetamol, ibuprofen, aspirin. Great, those are great symptomatic drugs to treat fever. Brings your temperature down. You feel a bit better. Great, well done. Why not do that? But ibuprofen, aspirin, paracetamol, they're not antibiotics. They're not going to kill the bug. You'll still have the bug, but your temperature will be lower, so you feel a bit better. And when we tank our patients up on SSRIs and hypnotics and benzodiazepines to treat the overlying symptoms of their trauma-based disorder, that's what we're doing. We're treating their temperature with a paracetamol. It's not good enough. So we have polypharmacy. We also have polypsychotherapies. Now, I'm sure there's loads of psychologists in the audience who are way more experienced than me, so I have to be careful what I say. But after 30 years in psychiatry, I would go as far as to say no particular psychological model is the correct model. The most important fundamental thing about psychotherapy is the relationship between the patient and the therapist. And, you know, what have we got to treat trauma? DBT, EMDR, trauma-focused psychotherapy, exposure therapy, CBT, IPT, CAT, all the T's you can imagine. But what they really come down to is the relationship between the patient and the therapist. And they are good, don't get me wrong. These psychotherapies are good to a certain extent. And what is the fundamental aspect of psychotherapy? Sharing your pain with someone you trust and working through that. And that's great, and that works well for a significant number of people. And you can get so far, and until that big question comes up, tell me about that night when you were 10 years old and your grandfather came into your bedroom. At that point, the patient, out the door, back to the vodka, back to the heroin. Because by the time that patient's in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they've become an absolute expert at doing anything but talk about that night. You become so avoidant of that trauma, you just can't do it. And this is why we have a massive high treatment resistance for PTSD, 60% treatment resistance, and a staggeringly, embarrassingly high treatment resistance for addictions. 80 to 90% treatment resistance for addictions. That is not good enough after 100 years of modern psychiatry. We were better at treating alcoholism in the Victorian times than we are today. This is an awful statistic, and no part of medicine would accept these kinds of outcomes. You can see where I'm going with this. So, I was working as an addiction psychiatrist, and I was seeing all these cases of alcoholism, and it became obvious that alcoholism in adults was essentially PTSD plus alcohol. Every single one of them had trauma, whether it was big T trauma, like physical or sexual abuse, or small T trauma, or even people just saying, yeah, I had a pretty rubbish childhood. I didn't feel very loved or wanted. That wouldn't hit the social services radar, but everybody had poor experiences of childhood, and so many of them had stories and narratives about themselves that were very, very negative and stuck. So we thought, well, will MDMA work to treat alcoholism? We know that MDMA works to treat PTSD because the MAPS studies were showing that, and we know that MDMA works as a non-specific adjunct to psychotherapy, provides this peak experience, it provides this personality change that I mentioned earlier. But does it produce a spiritual or mystical experience? Because as I showed from those earlier studies, all of the successful psychedelic studies for addictions were more successful if the patient had a peak mystical spiritual experience. Now, MDMA doesn't tend to do that very much. About 5 to 10% of people on their first threshold dose MDMA experience will report a mystical experience, a communion with God, a sort of being part of a greater whole sort of thing, which is not very high compared to the 80 to 90% who will report that on LSD or magic mushrooms. Classic psychedelics do this pretty much every time. It's what it says on the tin. MDMA does lots of useful things, but it doesn't really produce a mystical experience. So we just didn't know if it would work. So it was an interesting experiment. Now, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, if you were going to invent a drug to improve trauma-focused psychotherapy, you would come up with MDMA. It's the most wonderful molecule. It's short-acting, sort of 4 to 6 hours. It's mildly perceptually disturbing, but not like dripping walls and melting faces type sort of classic hallucinogen. It's very pleasurable. Which is good. It's good. That's a very important tool when developing a drug to be clinically deliverable. You know, LSD, psilocybin, very useful drugs, but like Aldous Huxley said, it could be heaven or it could be hell. It can go either way. MDMA just pretty much works every time with everyone. It's very hard not to have a positive affect with MDMA. Sometimes when I'm teaching neurology to medical students, there are not that many drugs in psychiatry that are invariably pleasurable, opiates being the others. I've given so many people heroin over the years as a junior doctor, and every single one of them on the end of the needle says, "Ah, that's amazing." MDMA is pretty similar. Everyone loves it. If you don't like heroin, you don't have a brain. You need to go and talk to a neurologist because you've got some seriously wrong wiring going on. Now, I'm not encouraging anyone to take heroin. I'm emphasizing the invariable pleasure of opiates. And MDMA is similar. So it's very pleasurable, it's very clinically applicable, it's very, very safe. Very safe. Now, I've been talking about MDMA for 15, 20 years, and I used to put up loads of graphs of ecstasy users and neurotoxicity, trying to convince myself and the audience. I just don't bother now. I'll just tell you it's very, very safe. Very, 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 very safe. It's very widely used, and the actual toxicity, morbidity, mortality is very low indeed, considering how massively used it is in the population. And that's just a fact, and I can give you details about that if you ask me. So it's safe, but it's this ability to access these painful memories and enhance empathy that seems to make it so good. So how does MDMA work? Well, a lot of people say, oh, it increases serotonin. It's a bit more sophisticated than that. At the 5-HT1A and 1B receptors, this induces this positively felt mood, this reduction in depression and anxiety, this euphoric or ecstasy type effect, if you like. At the 5-HT2A receptors, which is where the classic psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin act, it's got a mild effect here, but as I said, not as intense, not total ego dissolution like you get with classic psychedelics, but enough to sort of think outside the box and have new ways of looking at old things. And then it's got this weird paradoxical effect where via the amphetamine part of the molecule, you're speeded up, you're motivated, and it enhances your attachment to therapy. And then paradoxically at the same time, by the alpha-1 and 2 receptors, you're slowed down, which is perfect because that takes the edge off the hypervigilance that goes with painful trauma recall. So anyone in the audience who's perhaps taken ecstasy, and you all look pretty groovy, and I'd say probably about 30% of you at least have, you will be aware of this unusual experience of being both speeded up and slowed down at the same time. Now, what that does from a therapeutic point of view, that puts you into this optimal arousal zone for psychotherapy. You're speeded up enough to engage and motivated, but you're slowed down enough to not be overwhelmed by the trauma recall and the hypervigilance. And then finally, it has an effect, a hormonal effect in oxytocin, raises oxytocin, and as you know, oxytocin is the hormone secreted from the brains of breastfeeding mothers. It's the hormone that engenders a sense of connection and empathy and bonding. So now if you put all these things together, you come up with this wonderful statement. MDMA selectively inhibits the fear response whilst leaving the other faculties intact. Selectively inhibits the fear response whilst leaving the other faculties intact. That's very, very important, and it's the selectivity that makes it so unique pharmacologically. Many drugs will reduce the fear response. A bottle of vodka will beautifully reduce the fear response. A bag of heroin will beautifully reduce the fear response. And that's why these two drugs are the #1 choices in people with trauma. But they're very messy drugs. If you use heroin or use alcohol, you can't do any psychotherapeutic work on those drugs. You'll just be talking rubbish, and you certainly won't remember it the next day. MDMA beautifully, uniquely, selectively turns off fear, but you can talk, you can remember, you can debate, you can recall memories of your childhood, you can make a cup of tea, you can walk around, and crucially, you will remember it the next day, because that psychotherapeutic work you've done with that turned off amygdala response will last. And it just turns off the fear. And I will share an anecdote with you. Many years ago, before I was a professional, I was a DJ in the 90s, and it's fair to say I might have had some exposure to ecstasy. And I remember lying there after some rave, and everyone's lying there, we're kind of just teenagers, and like everyone's loved up and like, oh man, it's so beautiful. And someone said, let's try and think of the worst thing in the world. And we all lay there and everyone went, let's imagine our mums dying. And we all lay there and went, it's not that bad. And I didn't know about MDMA psychotherapy, but that's kind of what we do. That's really the cornerstone of MDMA psychotherapy. You are given permission to go to that avoidant memory, that one thing you don't want to talk about is okay. So you shift that group from that 50% treatment resistance who hit that brick wall of psychotherapy because of the dissociation, and you shift them into the treatment responding group because they can actually do the psychotherapy, actually talk about that stuff. And there is our traumatized brain from child abuse with its exaggerated amygdala response and its shrunken prefrontal response, the physical brain damage that comes from hurting children psychologically. And there's MDMA. It shrinks the amygdala response, it turns off the fear center, and it boosts the prefrontal response, and it allows the patient to feel positivity. And I'll share another anecdote with you. I had a patient on MDMA in our last study, and she was lying there, and she was saying, "Oh, Dr. Ben, this is so beautiful, I feel so good, and I've never felt like this before, and is this love? Is this what love is like?" And I sort of thought for a second, I thought, she's taken a drug. This is a transient, artificial, drug-induced experience. Of course, this isn't that lofty, noble thing, love. This is just a drug, And then I stopped and thought, and I went, well, hang on. She's safe, she's contained, she's warm, she's trusting, she's empathic. And I said, yeah, this is love. This is what love is like. And she went, oh my God, I had no idea. She said, all my life I've only ever known pain and fear. And people have even said to me things like, I love you. And she sort of awkwardly said back, oh, I love you too. But she never really meant it because she'd never felt it. Because from the day she was born, she'd only experienced pain. So yes, it's an artificial drug-induced experience. It's not real love. But if you've never had that experience, to have that for a few precious, privileged hours, she has now a platform on which to move forward. And the next day we talked about this, and she said, I now know what I'm looking for because of that MDMA experience. That was a study done in Imperial. So we set up the Bristol Imperial MDMA for Alcoholism study. It was an open-label study, no control group, no placebo group, which you might say, well, Dr. Sessa, that's a bit methodologically unsound, but it's what you have to do when you come up with a new drug in a new condition. You start with a safety and tolerability study. So they all got MDMA. We used the MAPS model in terms of the dyadic male-female pairs, and the patients took MDMA on 2 occasions, sandwiched between non-drug sessions, and that's very important, the non-drug prep sessions and the post-drug integration sessions. And that's what the protocol looked like. So we took patients who were heavy daily drinkers. They went through a 2-week medical detox to bring their alcohol down to 0. Then they came into the 8-week MDMA course, in which they took MDMA twice on weeks 3 and 6, sandwiched between non-drug sessions. Then we followed them up for 9 months to collect outcome data. Now, people, especially psychologists, ask me, what psychological model did you use? And the very lazy but accurate answer is, we used MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for alcohol use disorder therapy. Because, it'd never been done before. We were making it up. We had to. There was no manual to do this. It was new. I mean, a more nuanced answer, there was elements of motivational enhancement therapy, elements of CBT, elements of transpersonal therapy, especially during the drug sessions. And I can let you now know that we are in the process of writing this into a manual. But the truth is, there was no roadmap for how to carry out psychotherapy for people with alcohol use disorder. But there will be. I love this graph because it is so spectacularly boring. It says absolutely nothing of any interest, which is exactly what you want in a safety and tolerability study. No abnormal bloods, no abnormal ECGs, no suicides, no self-harm. Everyone tolerated it. So extremely boring results, but exactly what you want when you're looking at safety and tolerability. We fulfilled the criteria of the study effectively. Now, MDMA is ridiculously safe, as I said. If MDMA or ecstasy was really dangerous, we would know about it by now in public health. So in the UK, 750,000 doses of MDMA or ecstasy are taken every weekend. Every weekend, 750,000 doses for the last 30 years. And the rates of morbidity or mortality are staggeringly low. We're talking maybe 5 to 10 deaths a year in the UK that can be solely attributed to MDMA, all of which can be easily avoided with decent drug education. So nothing is 100% safe. Lions, water, love, these things are all dangerous. That's why we regulate them. We don't ban them. Are lions banned? No, they're probably regulated, aren't they? So it's incredibly safe. And when a new drug comes into the society, you learn about it pretty quickly in addiction services. So, for example, MCAT. Do you remember that? Mephedrone, not to be confused with methadone. Cathinone, MCAT, came into the scene in around about 2009. Within 6 to 12 months, we were seeing hospital clinics full of MCAT casualties. Addictions, overdoses, problems. So it happens pretty quickly. Now, we've had MDMA for 30 plus years in Europe and the UK. And I challenge any psychiatrists here to tell me that they've worked with lots of cases of MDMA addiction or MDMA toxicity. Some ER doctors will certainly have worked with people who've taken what they think might be MDMA and had overdoses. All of those deaths can be easily prevented. So I'm really hammering home the point here that even recreational ecstasy is not that dangerous. It's second to cannabis in terms of its epidemiology of use. Well, MDMA and cocaine have been battling it out for second place for a long time now, but it's a very widely used drug, yet we don't see a lot of morbidity and mortality. So it is very safe. And the point is, clinical MDMA is not ecstasy. Clinical MDMA is a pharmaceutical product provided by a clinician in a controlled medical setting on screened and monitored patients. So any risks that there could be can be reduced to an absolute minimum. So that's a nice thing to know, that it's very safe to work with MDMA. Nevertheless, the ethics committee, in their wisdom, wanted us to very carefully monitor our patients on MDMA. So we took their temperature and their blood pressure and their heart rate throughout the session, and these are the pooled results. As you can see with those BPs, diastolic and systolic BP, you have this nice kind of takeoff, plateau and landing effect. Nobody had any abnormal physiology throughout the study. Everyone found it completely non-toxic, which is what we would expect. Some people ask me this: what about come downs? And what about what they call Blue Monday, or I don't know what they call it, I'm too old now, Black Tuesday, Suicide Wednesday, this 3 or 4 day post-ecstasy affect drop that apparently comes from using MDMA. Well, we looked at this really closely, and we published a paper last year called Debunking the Myth of Blue Mondays, because we did not find any come downs across 26 MDMA sessions. None. Nobody had come downs. Nobody had affect drop into 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 days later. In fact, they felt great. So this is the profile of mood states, or POMS scale. Now, the way this scale works is any numbers over 0, positive numbers, are depression or low mood. 0 is just a flat euthymia, and anything in negative is not only not depressed, but it's actually positively felt mood. So what you can see here of these results is, across the 2 studies, people had an afterglow that lasted for a week. We didn't expect to see this. We expected some degree of affect drop. There just wasn't any. They didn't have come downs, and they felt great for a week afterwards. So this then asks the question, because I'm not for a minute suggesting that the phenomenon of come downs and Blue Mondays doesn't exist in the MDMA, in the ecstasy using population. It does. It's a well-recognized phenomenon. So why does it happen? Well, I would argue that this is because there are multiple confounding factors in the way that people take ecstasy. So think about how you take ecstasy. What do? You go to the pub, you drink 2 pints, you go to a club, you take a pill at midnight, you go to the bar, you have another 2 drinks, you have another pill at 2 a.m., you then drink a bit more, then you do another pill at 6 a.m., you go back to someone's house, you snort some amphetamine, you snort some cocaine, you drink a bottle of wine, you drink endless cups of tea, you stay up all night. Maybe on Sunday night, if you're lucky, you'll have a cup of soup and get about 3 hours sleep. Then you go to work on Monday morning and you feel like crap, and then you say, oh man, it's serotonin depletion because of that ecstasy. It's not, it's a hangover. You've been proper caning it all weekend, and this is one of the issues. So what this tells us is we cannot make inferences about clinical MDMA based on recreational ecstasy users, because how many recreational ecstasy users come to the clinic after having an ECG, preparing with their therapist, taking the ecstasy at 9 in the morning, completely straight, with no other drugs. They come down by 5 p.m., they eat a nice meal, they sleep like a baby, and they feel great. So there may or may not be this phenomenon of serotonin depletion, but we certainly cannot make inferences about clinical MDMA based on looking at ravers, whatever they are. So in terms of our outcomes, Now, before we did the MDMA study, we took a long time to get our MDMA because it has to be 99.98% pure. So we had to recrystallize 5 or 6 times, and we lost a lot of yield, and we eventually got there, but we were 18 months late. And so we did this study. It's not a control group. Very important to state this. Not a control group. These are not randomized groups. This was a separate study. We did a treatment as usual study. We took a group of people undergoing detox in Bristol, and we looked at their outcomes at 9 months with no intervention from our team. So they had all sorts of interventions. They had the very best that modern medicine can throw at them. So they all started with a very high level of alcohol use. They had their 2-week detox and came down to 0. And then, with no intervention from us, we followed them up. And very sadly, but not unexpectedly, by 9 months, the majority had relapsed to the same levels of drinking to when they pre-detox. Typical picture, you see this all over the world. This is how good modern medicine is at treating alcohol use disorder. And these people had everything. They had AA, groups, MAP groups, one-to-one therapy, inpatient rehabs, anti-craving drugs, all the very best that modern medicine throws at the alcoholic. Now, those are the results from the MDMA study. Came in with high levels of drinking, came down to 0 with the detox, and at the end of the detox, we have 19% who were, 18.7 units per alcohol in a week after the course. So if we put those two graphs on top of each other, and I need to stress, because I have been criticized for this, these are 2 separate studies. This is not 2 arms of a randomized study. One is a treatment as usual group, the red group, and the black group is the MDMA. Now, this was an open label study. No placebo, it might not be the MDMA at all, it might be the wonderful therapists. So what we need to do is repeat this with a placebo, but this is a staggering graph. One way or another, however you look at it, the people in Bristol who went through the MDMA study did better than the people who didn't, by a very long way. So this is a wonderful take-home graph, and we're extremely proud of it. We also looked at trauma, and just very briefly, those patients who had higher levels of trauma in our cohort had higher rates of relapse. So having high levels of childhood trauma or adult trauma is a risk factor in recovery from addiction, which we kind of knew, but it was nice to see that. And there's a few qualitative statements here from the study. You know, a lot of these patients had multiple detoxes in the past. One of them had 5 or 10 different inpatient detoxes and rehabs, and they all spoke very, very positively about the MDMA course as being effective and beneficial to them. So obviously, the next step is to do a randomized control study to randomize people into either MDMA or placebo and see if we can demonstrate efficacy for the MDMA. And the ultimate goal is to get MDMA-assisted psychotherapy licensed as a treatment for alcohol use disorder with FDA and EMA, so we can start using it as soon as possible. Now, we're a long way behind MAPS, who are moving this forward for MDMA for PTSD, but we've started the process, and hopefully it's not going to take 35 years like it's taken Rick Doblin. So we're going to get this process pushed forward. Now, I just want to go through a few of these theoretical objections. These sorts of questions that probably less enlightened audiences than yourselves might ask. You can't give psychedelics as a treatment for addiction. You're swapping one dangerous drug for another. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, there are very, very few things you can do to yourself that are worse than drinking a bottle of vodka a day. There's no medical intervention that is worse than a bottle of vodka a day. So if you're going to take MDMA once, twice, 3 times in a controlled clinical setting and it stops you drinking a bottle of vodka a day, it absolutely satisfies the risk-benefit ratio. So using drugs to come off drugs is not a bad thing if you're using better drugs to come off worse drugs. So that's absurd. Risk of addictions to psychedelics. This is absurd. Psychedelics have a very low addiction potential, MDMA including, and especially the classic psychedelics. They're just not on the radar for drug services. You know, and there's 3 bits of evidence for this. Number 1 is animal studies. You can do these animal studies where animals press a lever and they get a reward. And if you give them alcohol, they keep pressing the lever all the time. You give them cocaine, they keep pressing the lever. You give them benzodiazepines, keep pressing the lever. And they just keep doing it until they die of starvation because they are so desperate for the drug. You give them a psychedelic, they'll press it once, and then they'll kind of move to the back of the cage and say, I'm done. So animal studies do not demonstrate high risk of addiction. The second bit of evidence is epidemiology of public health drug use. You do not see drug-seeking associated behavior with psychedelics. Nobody breaks into your house to steal your TV to get their next magic mushroom fix. We do not see clinics and wards and outpatient community drug services full of psychedelic users. That's just not on the radar. And the third bit of evidence is the last 20 years of psychedelic research. All these people who've been going through all these studies with psilocybin, DMT, ketamine, MDMA, the numbers who are actually then becoming addicted to them as a result of their clinical use it's negligible, if not zero, for most of those compounds. So these are not highly addictive drugs, so that's bollocks. So the next one, lack of research of proven efficacy. Now, it's true that the majority of the studies that have been done in the last 20 years are small, they're pilot studies. Yeah, we need to do more randomized control studies. That's all true, but even though they're small studies, they have all been spectacular results, all of them. Whether it's OCD, anorexia nervosa, PTSD, personality disorders, addictions with all the different compounds, they've all had graphs like the one I showed you. They have all blown out of the water the current best treatments. Now, small studies, but that's a massively important thing. There's plenty of investigational studies that don't have good results and you just give them up. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people anecdotally who will talk about the positive benefits of psychedelics. So there is absolutely enough proven efficacy to continue this research. They all work, except for the recent microdosing studies. But don't get me started on microdosing. So, sends the wrong message regarding drug policy. Do not get me started on talking about drug policy. Drug policy is inhumane, unpoliceable, unethical, unscientific. Successive Home Secretaries have blood on their hands for the deaths of people for prohibition. It does not work. It increases the death, the harm, crime, the usage, weirdly, of drugs when you prohibit them. If you ban something, it does not go away. It just becomes really dangerous and you hand the franchise to the mafia. There's nothing more crazy than banning drugs to try and control them. If drugs are safe, then we don't need to do anything about them. If drugs are dangerous, then we need to regulate them. Dangerous things need to be regulated, not banned. If we banned scuba diving, it wouldn't go away. All you'd do is get these underground or underwater scuba diving schools opening up with poor equipment, no training, no scrutiny, no supervision, no right to reply, no customer services, and people would start dying of scuba diving. That's what would happen, and that's what happens with drugs. We stick our heads in the sand, we ban them, we pretend they've gone away. They haven't gone away, we've just created a dangerous problem. And I think one of the problems of drug policy reform, this is in my opinion of recent years, is we are not doing enough to engage the non-drug users, because the non-drug users think that drug policy reformers just want to facilitate hippies getting high and not getting busted. That is not the reason why we need drug policy reform. It's not just to facilitate drug users. We need drug policy reform because it is the wrong bloody policy to manage the problem. And it affects everyone, whether you use drugs or not, or whether you hate drugs or like drugs. It is the wrong policy. Now, I don't like horse riding. I have no interest in horse riding whatsoever. Couldn't care less about horse riding. But I'd like to know that the policies in place that manage horse riding are the right ones, especially if it costs me, the taxpayer, £20 billion a year in mopping up the problems due to rubbish horse riding policies. That's the situation we're in. We need to shift the focus of drug policy reform away from drug users towards everybody, because we are all affected by awful policy, and it is awful policy. And we will look back in 5, 10, 20 years, whenever the United Nations finally scraps that 1971 charter, we will look back and we will hang our heads in shame at the socio-political folly of drug prohibition. Drugs don't kill people, prohibition does, and that's the message. Every single drug death I've worked with, which is many, every single one would have been prevented had it not been for drug prohibition. so we can do something about that. So that's rubbish. Costly and difficult. Yes, very, very costly and difficult. Human psychopharmacology research is really expensive. You know, if you wanted to do some little study like giving 8 people an aspirin, it would probably cost you £100,000 and take 4 years. It's really expensive to do pharmacology studies. And these are particularly expensive because there's no pharma backing. You know, who's going to pay for a $75 million program to make MDMA? Nobody owns MDMA. Pharma research comes from pharma companies who've developed a new model, a new molecule, which they patent, and it takes around $50 to $100 million to get that molecule to market. And then they own that molecule, and they reap back all the money for their R&D by selling it, especially drugs like SSRIs that you have to take every day. You only have to take MDMA twice, then you don't need any more drugs at all. Who's going to pay for that? So it's ridiculous. This is why it's so slow. And this is why we're moving towards a profit-driven market for developing psychedelics, and I think that is the only realistic way of doing it. Erroneous and stigmatizing public perception. Yeah, this still exists, you know. You guys are all very enlightened, but the majority of people are not. You know, the majority of people outside of this room, they believe that one ecstasy pill will kill you, and LSD makes you jump out of windows. You know, these things are ingrained in our society. And I can forgive people for these attitudes, you know. We've been telling people for the last 50 years that cannabis, LSD, magic mushrooms are dangerous killer drugs that destroy society and are addictive. And now suddenly in the last few years we're saying, actually, they're really quite useful and really safe. You know, you can understand why people have these negative attitudes. In a way, psychedelic research doesn't need any more research. We know they work. We know they're effective. There's no reason why they can't all be licensed tomorrow. What psychedelic research needs is good PR. We need advertising agencies. We need to sell this to people because it's got such a bad name for itself. I was doing a talk at the Royal College about 12 years ago on LSD, and there was a Q&A at the end, and some guy stuck his hand up, and he was like a senior ER doctor working in A&E, senior ER doctor, and he said, "Dr. Sessa, I'm shocked to hear you talking about LSD, a dangerous killer drug." And I said, "Why did you say that?" He said 2 weeks ago, patient came into my casualty department, and they'd taken 17 tabs of LSD. And I was like, okay. And he said they were doing naked somersaults in the waiting room. And I was like, oh, okay. And I said, did they need to be admitted? And he said, no, their friends came and took them home. And then I said, and did they need to be followed up with psychiatric services? And he said, yes, well, the crisis team gave them a call a few days later and he was fine. I said, right, so you've told me that LSD is a dangerous killer drug and you object to my presentation. And your example is a patient who's taken 17 times the recommended dose, and his only pathology was naked somersaults. And I said, what if this person had taken 17 grams of cocaine? Or 17 bottles of wine, you know? That person would be in intensive care or dead, and you know it. But this is an intelligent person who has just this knee-jerk reaction. And this is an example of the stigmatizing situation that we have with psychedelics. Even clever, erudite, intellectual people who are professionals do not share our wonderful attitude. We need to do something about that, because no amount of research is going to change that. We need to sell this. I was saying to Eva the other day, it's like, in some ways, LSD, maybe it's just a terrible product. You know, if you were to ask an advertising agency like Saatchi & Saatchi, I've got this product, I want to sell it. Right, okay, what is it? LSD. How long has it been around? 75 years? Okay, how many people have taken it? About 1.5% to 2% in the world. They would look at it and they go, maybe it's just a rubbish product. You know, you've had 75 years to promote this and only 2% of the entire population have taken it when it's freely accessible. And then you say, yeah, but those 2% who have will tell you that it's the most profound, life-changing experience of their lives. Why can't we sell this stuff? Why does it have such a negative attitude? And I don't really know the answer to that. It must be to do with drug laws. So I think I'm kind of almost nearing the end, but how much time have I got anyway? I'll keep going. 10 minutes? 5 to 10 minutes. Okay.
I think maybe the feds have hacked us.
Yeah, I don't know what.
Oh, that sort of works.
Kind of.
Will it still flick through the slides?
Well, it will flip, but it looks strange.
That's okay. Strange is good. Yeah, so we're in this weird psychedelic renaissance at the moment. Why are we in a psychedelic renaissance? Why is it different? Lots of different reasons why this is happening. The most important thing is we have a second bite of the cherry now. You know, it all ended in the late 60s, and we had this 30, 40-year hiatus. But it's now happening again, and we must not screw it up this time. We have to make it work this time. And we have neuroimaging, and we have, neuroimaging, and we have science, and we have policy change all over the world. We have cannabis becoming medicalized. And I think this is good, and we need to stay with this. And I think that data and being boring and sober and conservative and wearing a tie and all of these sorts of things help, because we need to find the language to communicate this to the authorities. And the authorities do not speak the hippie language. When we were designing the MDMA study, we were trying to work out what to put in the patient leaflet about the effects of MDMA. And somebody said, wow, it opens the heart chakra. And I went, we can't put opens the heart chakra. So we had to change it to it produces a strongly felt positive mood. You know, you need to find the language to talk to the authorities, or we ain't going to get anywhere. And there are some people in the psychedelic community who object to medicalization and corporatization. I do not object to this. I consider this accessibility, increasing accessibility to more people who could benefit from these medicines. These medicines are too good to stay amongst this 2% of white, trustafarian, middle-class Western users who are using them at the moment. Most of my patients are hard, shaven-headed, tattooed, tracksuit-wearing people who would run a mile if I talked to them about chakras and energy levels and sitar music and burning incense. That is not their world. We need to meet the patients where they are. We need to readdress the way we approach psychedelic research. Why do we have pictures of Buddha and batiks and Indian throws up on the walls when we do psychedelic research? Why don't we have a picture of Beyonce and Manchester United, you know? If those things are our patients' power objects, that's what we should be meeting them with, not expecting them to have dreads and rainbow t-shirts. We need to make this accessible to the people who benefit. It's been a massive pleasure working with all these different studies. Over the years, I have been injected with intravenous LSD and psilocybin and DMT and ketamine, taken MDMA, all legally. There's not many doctors that can stand on the record and say they've had all of those drugs as a research subject and also administering them, and I'm okay. So it's a fascinating world to get involved in, and I urge everyone to get involved. I remember in Oxford 15 years ago, my tutor saying to me, Ben, why are you aligning yourself with these crazy hippies? You know, this is career suicide, he said. Career suicide. Far from career suicide. You know, this is not some crazy fringe subject. This is not something that just beardos from California do. This is cutting-edge neuroscience. Every single major neuroscientific institution in the world is now carrying out psychedelic research. This is where it's at in biological psychiatry. This is our clinic in Bristol. We are not just a ketamine clinic. You've probably heard of ketamine clinics where people use ketamine as an antidepressant. You take an infusion of ketamine, you feel okay for about somewhere between 2 days and 2 weeks, and then you have to have another one. This is maintenance therapy as an antidepressant. I mean, it's okay, it's arguably better than other antidepressants, short-acting and brief-acting and rapid-acting, but you have to maintain it. Well, that's not what we do. We use ketamine in the same way as we use MDMA and psilocybin. So myself and Dr. Higbed, my co-therapist, we're both trained in MDMA, psilocybin, and ketamine. We use it as an adjunct to psychotherapy. We use the therapeutic window that occurs with this neurogenesis as a result of the ketamine, and that's when we then get in there and we hit the patient with these narratives. And one of the lovely ways of describing it is, if you imagine a ski slope, a mountain, and you've got a ski run, and you always take the same ski run down every night, every day, and that ski run becomes very deep and ingrained because it's the same path. That is your go-to negative narrative. I am useless. I am a failure. No one loves me.
and it becomes your default pathway. And the more you use a pathway, the fatter it becomes, the faster it becomes, the more dendritic connections it has, and it becomes the go-to pathway. And as I was explaining at the beginning, that arises as a result of pain and trauma in childhood, and it was neuroprotective back then. It helped you stay alive. But now you're an adult, you don't really need it, but it's still there. So, you know, there you are as an adult with anxiety disorder or whatever, and there's a queue at the post office, and you have a panic attack and feel like everyone's out to get you. No one's out to get you, it's just a queue at the post office. But it's because of this ingrained neural pathway that has become your default pathway. Now, ketamine, it's a beautiful analogy. You've got the ski slope on the mountain. Ketamine is a fresh fall of snow overnight, so deep in snow, and you come up to the top of the mountain the next day, and you can take any way down the mountain. You can choose a new way down the mountain. You don't have to go down this default pathway. So this is what's happening neurobiologically with ketamine. It's creating new pathways, new neurons, new networks, new opportunities. And then we hone that with psychotherapy to say, right, your brain is bristling with activity. What do you want it to be? What do you want to grow over this old pathway? And we use it not just for depression, but for anxiety and PTSD and eating disorders and addictions as well. Now, the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy protocol, just like any other psychedelic protocol, it's this mixture of non-drug and drug sessions. So you'll have preparation sessions followed by drug-assisted sessions. And it's really having the 4 sessions weekly that really helps, because you're really setting the brain up. I say to the patient after the session when they go home, the drug session, I'll say, at this exact moment, your brain is bristling with activity. New neurons are popping up. It's growing. What do you want it to be? Come back tomorrow morning and we'll tell it what it's going to be from now on. And I had a patient just yesterday morning, just before I came here, and she was describing, I'll finish in a minute, and she was saying to me yesterday, after her first ketamine session, she said, I had this, I was speaking to my friend of mine, she had anxiety disorder. She said, this friend of mine did this really kind thing for me. She picked me up and took me somewhere, and it was a really kind act. And the next morning, after the ketamine, she said to her friend, thanks, that was really nice. And I said, what's wrong with that? And she said, I've never said that before. If someone does something kind for me, I feel anxious and guilty, and I don't deserve to have gratitude to have anyone do anything nice. And she said, I just feel different. I said, how does it feel? She says, really weird. I can't get my head around it. Why am I not feeling anxious and guilty? I felt anxious and guilty my whole life, but today I don't. I just feel normal. And I said, that's fantastic. Let's nurture that. I said, what you've done there, your go-to default neuron of I'm always doing something wrong has been snowed over. And you've got a new option now. And it can be just gratitude and thanks and empathy and kindness. So we're using psychotherapy to overgrow this rigidity which underpins all mental disorder. And we're doing research at Awakn. We're carrying out some new molecule design. We're training new therapists. We're opening physical clinics. We have 3 clinics open at the moment in Bristol, London, and Oslo. I'd love to open a clinic in Prague because I think Prague's pretty sick, but I don't know. I mean sick as in good, and possibly sick. But we're growing these new clinics. We're doing research. We're training therapists, and we're developing new molecules. And it's a beautiful place. Come to Bristol. Bristol's like the San Francisco of the UK. It's full of cool people. And I think I'll stop there. So thank you very much.